a warm welcome to this evening's event, Becoming a Barrister. My name is Clara Jennings, and I'm a final year law student at Arden University, and I'm an ambassador for aspiring barristers who bring this event to you this evening. Aspiring Barristers is an organisation centred around supporting aspiring barristers in their journey to the bar and promotes and supports accessibility and diversity to ensure that a career at the bar is a serious option for everyone. So this evening's event aims to provide you with practical tips, guidance on your progression to the bar, and the panellists will hopefully be able to answer some of your questions. So I'd like to welcome Ali, Jeanette and Kane. Ali is in his second sixth at St Mary's Chambers. Jeanette Stevenson is a barrister at Great James Street, and Kane joins us from 18 St John's Chambers. Welcome to all of you this evening.
Hello.
Hello.
So firstly, I'd like to know a little bit more about yourselves and your journey to the bar. So let's kick off the evening with Kane. Why did you want to become a barrister, and what drew you to the profession?
Oh, right. Well, I did a geography degree. I love geography, but it came to the end of it and I didn't really want to leave university. And I found out that you could stay on and do law fresh as a master's degree without having to do an undergraduate degree in that subject first. So I stayed on, really out of laziness more than anything. And it was quite easy to pay for because it was pre-credit crunch when banks would just throw money at you. It's not as easy nowadays. And like many people who wanted to, who ended up doing a law degree, I assumed that I was going to become a corporate solicitor because that's who advertised, that's where most of the work is. I'd never met a barrister, I'd never considered being a barrister. And the thing that really pushed it for me was that I went to do some work experience at a law firm, and they were sending all the interesting work out to barristers. And I thought, hold on a minute, maybe that's something that I should consider. So I found some like-minded people at university. I went to court, I got some mini pupilages under my belt, and I knew that this was the job for me, and I never looked back. I applied in my final year of university, and I got my pupilage straight away. I had a little bit of I think a year in between where I got some work in a law firm and started, and I've been doing it for 13 years.
Thank you, Kane. And let's move over to Jeanette.
So why did I want to be a barrister? To be honest, I'm a bit similar to Kane, really. I never grew up or, went through university with massive aspirations to become a barrister. In fact, I was in the police force to start with. As I grew up as a child, I wanted to be a policewoman. When I was about 19, 20, I joined as a police officer, and I was there for about 3 years. A job I really enjoyed, but I found that doing the job, I was actually quite interested in the law. So decided that I would like to go to university and study it. Didn't really have any money or any means to go to university at the time, but luckily I was selected by my local newspaper to win a scholarship, basically. So my local newspaper, the Derby Telegraph, paid for my law degree. During the law degree, of course, I was shown the role of solicitor, the role of barrister, and during that, attending court. I really quite liked going to the Crown Court. I liked seeing barristers on their feet and addressing members of the jury. I found it really interesting, whereas I wasn't so interested in sort of the litigation side of a solicitor. I preferred the on your feet, the advocacy side of things. So that's why I decided about my third year probably that I'd like to go on and do the bar course. So I think at that point I was probably about 23 or 24, so it took a while to find what I wanted to do, but I got there eventually.
Thanks, Jeanette. And then over to you, Ali. Why did you want to become a barrister?
So my journey is a bit more straightforward. Straight into a law degree. I pretty much wanted to do a bit of everything when I was younger, including being a pianist, even though I can't play the piano. But my logic was, with a law degree, it's an area that touches on different aspects of society. You do medical law, aspects of medicine, family law, aspects of various relationships, and so on and so forth. It was when I was doing mooting, I was exposed to the advocacy element I thought, oh, okay, whatever I want to do after university should have some level of public speaking, and that's obviously not barrister exclusive. But it was attending Inns of Courts trips, and to be perfectly honest, just realizing it was really only mainly the barristers who wore the wigs and the gowns, and I thought that was quite cool. But fortunately, as you know, most family barristers won't wear gowns and wigs unless you're dealing with criminal matters. After I completed my law degree, I went into lecturing, and obviously Clara knows about that. I taught Clara, and I got a lot out of it in terms of the public speaking aspect and obviously the law aspect of it as well. But I wanted to be involved in cases, and I suppose if you prefer to be in a case throughout the whole thing and you like litigation, the solicitor route you might prefer. I actually do like being thrown into the middle of things and being parachuted in and do multiple things at once, and that's what drew me towards the barristers side of things. And I eventually got my pupillage with St Mary's Chambers, which is a specially set in family, and I'm currently in my second sits with, I think, 1 month and 1 week to go.
That's fantastic, Ali. Yeah, whenever I'm doing events like this or speaking at events, I always have Ali in the back of my head because we did some public speaking with you, and I found it really, really beneficial, and thank you for that. So we're going to move on to discuss any obstacles that you guys had along the way to your career at the bar and how you overcome them. So Jeanette, if I can throw that one to you.
Yeah, so I suppose as soon as I decided that I wanted to become a barrister, which, like I said, it was sort of second year, third year of my law degree, I found that my university weren't particularly helpful on helping people, assisting them and encouraging them to go to the bar. In fact, our law school was very geared towards people going and doing the LPC, because I was at Derby and they offered the LPC. They didn't offer what was the BPTC at the time. So as you can imagine, everybody was very much geared towards that. I think there was only me and one other out of the whole of our year that actually went into the barristers course. But I suppose, I'm not from a traditional background of what is historically a traditional barrister. Not saying that there aren't people at the bar now that have similar backgrounds to me, similar sort of universities and qualifications and things like that. But there are still a majority of barristers and sets who only take on people that attend certain universities and have certain A levels and things like that. For me, when I was applying for pupillage, one of the first questions on the form is, what A levels do you have? And most of the time they want sort of 2 A's and a B, or 2 B's and an A, or what, they want somebody that can show that academically they're academically good enough to become a barrister, which is, fair enough. How do you measure one's intellectual ability apart from law degree? Well, of course, to me, I would say, well, are my A levels that relevant? Because I've just done a law degree. I've shown that I've done it very well. I've shown I've got a 2-1. I've got very high grades in crime, which I want to do, etc., etc. But I hadn't got A levels, and I couldn't get away from that. And the reason why I hadn't got A levels is because when I was at school, I did very well. I did 12 GCSEs, all A star to C. That was absolutely fine. But I was brought up in foster care. I was fostered as a child because, unfortunately, when I was 9, my mum passed away. And when I was 11, my dad passed away. So I went through, obviously, the whole of secondary education and some primary education being fostered. So I went to quite a good school, which was nice because, had I stayed with my parents, and of course, no disrespect to them, but we were living in quite a rough area of Derby, sort of a council estate. We didn't have 1 penny to rub together. My dad had an issue with drink, and there's no way that I would have had the opportunity to go to such a good school. So I did well in my GCSEs. However, come A-level time, I did enroll on A-levels, and one of my A-levels actually was law, but unfortunately there was a breakdown at home. I'd become a bit of a rebellion teenager. I wasn't getting along anymore with my foster parents. There was arguments of, you're not my parents, you can't tell me what to do. In hindsight, now I'm mature, I know it was all my fault, but at the time I thought I was right. So I ended up basically leaving my foster carers at 16 years old, which of course meant I had to get a job, I had to pay my own way, and I couldn't stay on and do A-level. So I dropped out of sixth form. My first job, I worked at Specsavers Opticians, making glasses in their factory at the back of the shop. I did loads of different jobs. I worked as a carer in a nursing home, a shop assistant, all sorts. You know, I went from job to job to job, was very unhappy, knew that I wanted to be a police officer, and eventually 19, 20 years old, I ended up going in the police, and I suppose the rest is history. But fast forward, applying, of course, to barristers' chambers, and the question, and you can get marks for it because they mark you on each thing, what are your A-levels? Well, mine's 0. So how do you get out? How do you get over that hurdle without losing lots of points, which means when they total them at the end, you don't pass the score to be given an interview? So what I had to be very clever about, I suppose, is making sure that I picked up marks in other areas. So yes, I might have missed 2 or 3 scores on the A-levels, but what else can I do? What else can I put in my application that means that I get the maximum marks elsewhere? So I suppose that's what I had to do. And I mean, we'll probably speak more about it later, but, you know, just because you have a barrier, and that was a big barrier, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't make it. You just have to look at the bigger picture and, you know, find your way really. And I suppose look at it and think, right, this is my goal. How do I get here? Might not be a straightforward way to get there, but there's, you know, as long as you get to where you need to be in the end, it really doesn't matter which route you take. So I'd say that was one. I had lots of obstacles, but I will be here all night. But that was one of my significant ones to start with.
That is such an amazing story and such an amazing achievement to get to where you are, going through everything that you've gone through in your life. Amazing. So, Kane, did you face any obstacles?
Not really. I'm an upper middle class, privately educated, straight white man. I'm the traditional barrister path. I've got, you know, all A's in my A-levels, of first, of masters, and if there was any obstacle, it's just, even with that, it's still extremely difficult to get a pupillage. I suffered rejections like I've never had in my life. I applied for 60 pupillages and 48 turned me down outright. I have no idea why, but it just shows you the level of competition. Even if you think you've ticked every box, it is still an extremely difficult path to take. I don't think I've got anything more to add than that. I've had a very cushioned path to the bar.
And Ali, anything that you could add to that?
First of all, I'd just like to say how important it is to hear Jeanette's background, and I'm sure we're all quite grateful to have heard that, because the reality is that there will be others who are probably currently in that situation, and it's quite important for them to hear that, so they know that it is possible and what someone in that position had to do to get where they are now. I'll pretty much have to follow on from what Kane has said in terms of I've been rather fortunate in my education and generally in the support I have with my family, and I owe pretty much everything to my family. The obstacle as such, and this is perhaps something a lot of applicants will connect to, is the application process itself, and I echo what Kane has said there. If you do everything right, if you're perfect on paper, statistically, you're still not likely to get pupillage, and that's the starting point. You do everything right, and you start the race. You don't win it. So the obstacle perhaps I faced is the application process for pupillage, particularly if you don't necessarily have lawyers in your family, can be quite a lonely process. You don't really have context a lot of the time because you'll apply, you might get rejected before a first interview, and you just don't know why. So what I did is I went out of my way to try and volunteer at certain events, bar mess foundations, attended Inns of Court events, and I'll say there is an enormous amount of practicing barristers who are more than willing to go out of their way to help. I had QCs who were willing to look over my 14-page gateway application. I think it's 14 pages as standard, and painstakingly go through it. My mentor at Lincoln's Inn was always supportive. Barristers are more than willing to offer privileges. There's obviously formal routes to go, but I think now with social media, particularly with LinkedIn and Twitter now, there's far more barristers, or at least far more accessibility. So I perhaps would say, in terms of the obstacle of negating the loneliness of the process, but also working out what you need to do, reach out. Networking now has changed. The reality of networking is not necessarily going to a conference and speaking to people face to face. That, for what hopefully that will be possible again, but at the moment, networking is things like LinkedIn. It's virtual events. So take as many opportunities, and I promise you, as I'm sure is the case with everyone here, people will listen and advise you. Whenever anyone asks me a question, I try and advise them. It's obviously not going to be worth as much as someone who's on the pupillage committee, but there's, for example, the website Pupillage and How to Get It. It's an incredible website. It just provides in-depth detail of each stage, first round, second round, and so on and so forth. So reach out, and I promise you people will assist. They won't give you the pupillage, nor should they, but they will assist.
Thank you, Ali. I think we've got some questions coming in here now. So I'm just going to let those build up and we'll address them at the end. So I want to move on to finances and the Inns of Court. I applied to Lincoln's Inn, like Ali, I'm now a member, and I didn't get scholarship. So how could one support themselves financially through the Inns of Court, or maybe through another route? Is there anything else that anyone can do to help them when they're going through that transition from undergrad and they're doing the bar training course? Kane?
Is this to any of us?
Jeanette? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure of any particular like funding or scholarships that you can get for the bar course, apart from the Inns of Court. My colleagues might be able to assist me on that. But as far as funding is concerned, you've also always got sort of loans that are particular for the bar course and things like that. Obviously, it's up to each individual if they want to make that commitment or not, because at the end of the day, it's a debt and it has to be paid back whether you're successful or not. For instance, I know when I was on the bar course, and I don't mean to put a dampener on it, but it's the reality of the situation. I had several people on my course that had took out, say, I don't know, a £20,000 loan to pay their fees, and they failed, which means at the end of it, you have no bar qualification and you owe £20,000. So that's the reality of it. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't work for some people. I think you pay it back 2 years later or something like that. But I think now, I'm not sure whether it's available for the bar course, but certainly when I applied, there was no funding for postgraduate education, and not even masters, I don't think. But I know that that's changed over the last few years. I know you can get, I think you can get postgraduate lending from the government for masters, and I think you can get it for the LPC now, as long as attached to the end of the LPC is like it's also a master's degree, if you see what I mean. So that means you can get the funding. I'm not sure if you can do the same for the bar, potentially. But yeah, apart from obviously help from family and bank loans, I'm not sure what else is available. But as far as the scholarships are available, I was lucky enough, I received a scholarship for mine from Middle Temple, and I would encourage you to join one of the inns as soon as possible. I think you can apply from the beginning of your second year, I think. I know I applied as soon as I could, but they're very helpful. Middle Temple, I mean, it's lovely going and visiting anyway and doing your dining, even if you don't end up doing the bar course, because, they're just absolutely fantastic places. But I know, I was lucky enough to get mine, and towards the end of my bar course, actually, I think it was literally a month before, or literally when I was doing my finals, I separated from my husband at the time. I'd got 2 young children, and it got to the point where I was all of a sudden in quite some financial difficulty because my life had took a turn and changed. I approached Middle Temple. They'd already given me a full scholarship. I think they'd already given me about 15 grand or something like that. And I approached them, and they gave me, I think, another £8,000, which is absolutely fantastic because it meant that I could, I think I'd actually been awarded my, because I got very competent, but I think until I'd paid my final fees, I wasn't allowed it, if you see what I mean. So they gave me more money, which, you know, if it wasn't for Middle Temple, there is absolutely no way on this earth I'd have been called to the bar and I'd have done my bar course, because, you know, I was, you know, I had 2 small children, and I didn't have a penny to rub together. So, but not saying it's the end of the world if you don't get a scholarship. It just wouldn't have been suitable for me, because if I had applied to the bank, they'd have laughed me out the door. Because, you know, at that time, I think my credit rating was lower than the Titanic. There was no chance I was getting any funding whatsoever. But I know one friend who, I think she's on the bar course at the moment, she joined an Inn of Court, or I think you can apply for the scholarship before you join the Inn of Court. I can't remember how she did it, but she didn't get the scholarship, but then on the next year she applied to another inn for a scholarship and she got the scholarship. So not saying that's the right thing to do, but sometimes it's not always a no. Don't give up.
Yeah, it's to keep your options open, I suppose. Most definitely. Kane, I really want to hit on this one with you, because I think that you've got some strong views about this. When it comes to the reality of getting on that bar training course and paying that money, is it worth it? And I think, you know what I mean, if someone realistically doesn't have the skills to do it, should they do it? If they don't have a pupillage maybe or other training lined up for themselves, should they go to do that bar training course straight out of their undergrad?
So the process goes, you have your degree, then you have to do the bar training course, and then you get a pupillage. And I think most people will just assume that you can just slide in and do one then the other. But the reality is the bar training course is very expensive. I think it costs upwards of £20,000 depending on where you do it. You've of course got living expenses while you're doing it. And if you don't get a pupillage after it, it's completely useless. It's not a very helpful recognized qualification. So my advice would be not to do it until either you have a pupillage secured or you're very sure that you're going to get one. And how do you know you're going to get one? Well, you do your research, you apply, you see how far you get. If you're getting interviews in your final year of university, then you know you're nearly there. You can look at other people's CVs, are mine similar? You can chat to people, get to know some barristers, get some advice. But my advice would be not to do it unless you know that there's a pupillage waiting at the end. And if there's a pupillage waiting at the end, you'll find it a lot easier to get a loan, to get a scholarship. And that would be my advice. It's a money-making organization. The firms that offer the BTC don't do it out of the goodness of their heart. They're there to make profit, and they will lie to you. And they'll tell you that you're great. Come on in, come pay me, do my course. But actually, it's a useless course. It's a means to an end only. So bear that in mind.
Thanks for that, Kane. And Ali, do you think becoming a lecturer has helped you with your process of becoming a barrister? And what was the process like for you? Because obviously you're a pupil barrister in your second six now. What was that whole process like from finishing your undergrad to then that space in between until you secured pupillage?
I will say, and particularly as perhaps someone who has more recently secured pupillage, if nothing else is going on in your life, pupillage, applying for it is horrible. It's an awful experience, and your self-esteem is a punching bag, and that's how it is. It seems quite strange, but to say this, but people really need to appreciate there isn't necessarily an issue with you. I was just trying to pull up some stats from last year. There was around 2,000 applicants. This is on the Gateway. 2,000 applicants to around 200 pupillages. Because this year, 3,300 applicants to roughly the same amount of pupilages. I cannot stress them enough. You can be perfect and not get it. There was this massive debate on Twitter recently. I don't leave the wrong impression. I'm more of sit back and eat popcorn kind of tweeter rather than someone who engages. But there was this massive debate about this point about that Kane has touched on, because for years there was no requirement to have at least a 2-1 to enter on the BPTC. Now, obviously, the relevance of a 2-1, it's far less relevant going back a few years. But in terms of now, it's the bare minimum. You're not special if you get a 2-1 or a first. You're not academic if you get it, because everyone has it, along with practical experience, and it's probably assisted a judge in some fashion. The competition is absolutely monstrous. When I applied, one thing I did spot is I genuinely loved lecturing. It did help me secure pupillage, and just from speaking to members on different committees and those who looked at my CVs and things, being a lecturer wasn't perhaps the most common thing to see on one's CV. So it definitely helped me to, at least for a millisecond, have someone just hold on to my application for a little bit longer. There's obviously the public speaking aspect of it. So I don't think I was ever rusty about it. It's not the same as advocacy, but there was some weight to say that I was used to lecturing perhaps 10 people at a time or over 200 people at a time. It obviously has a connection with the law, and it perhaps provided this somewhat of a reputation of coming in as an academic rather than being academic. So that definitely assisted me. One thing I will say is you should really be sure that you're willing to take the risk, not that you would get pupillage. I don't think anyone can confidently say they would get pupillage. If you get pupillage before the BPTC, that's great. That's looking less and less likely now. I cannot imagine the difficulty of committees now if you suddenly told them you couldn't take into account any experience post-undergrad. Everyone will come across as a clone. Everyone does mooting and so on and so forth. More and more people are getting pupillage a number of years after the BPTC. This might touch on one of the early topics, but one thing I'll say to those listening, in terms of funding and things like that, there's more of an emphasis on things like hardship funds in the INS, and there's specific funds for things like disabilities as well. There are competitions you can enter. I think, I'm just trying to remember, the law reform essay competition, I think that gives quite a substantial amount, as does the Kalisha Scholarship Trust. The point that Jeanette touched on, I can't say if it's true, but it does ring a bell. I have heard of individuals applying again for a scholarship. I think, and I would advise those who are listening to check this on the INS websites, if you haven't started the BPTC, you can apply again, or at the very least, you can apply at another IN. So that might be something. In terms of what happens if you don't get a scholarship, one of the reasons LPCs were so popular was that they would often be offered with a top-up master's, which meant that you were eligible for postgrad funding. More providers are doing that with what's now the BVC now, isn't it? Or whatever it is now. So in theory, and this should be checked as well, there are more opportunities to take on the BPTC or if it's equivalent with a top-up master's. That
I think we may have lost Ali there. I think we definitely have lost Ali there. So I'm gonna just move along for a minute and see can he get back online. So Kane, I'm gonna come to you again. How can students stand out in those pupillage applications? What do they need to do? What type of work experience or voluntary positions do they need to try and get just to add more marks, I suppose?
I think the thing to bear in mind is that, for example, in my chambers, we had 570 something applications last year. We were trying to recruit 4 pupils, and the average person is far more impressive than you can ever imagine. And we can only really interview the top 30, 40, there's limits to what we can do. And those top 40 people are fantastic. And so you need to have a realistic view of what is good and what is the norm, because some people are applying without realizing just how good the competition is. I have a sort of checklist when I'm advising people what to put in a form. But the key is, it's not just a question of saying, oh, I did a bit of mooting, I did a little bit of work experience. You have to show that you've excelled within that. You have to show that you've, if you haven't excelled, you have to show that you've made progress and how you've made progress. So I think there needs to be evidence of some sort of advocacy or public speaking, and not just that you've done it, that you've been very good at it. You need to show intelligence. For most people, that's by way of good grades, but that's not necessarily the case for a lot of people. Some people show intelligence in other ways. People skills. It can be people management. It can be dealing with vulnerable people. You have to demonstrate that you can act professionally in a professional environment. You've got to demonstrate how you know the bar works. Do you understand all the terminology? Can you fit in? You've got to demonstrate organizational skills. Most barristers are self-employed and are responsible for their own management of their day, really. And also enthusiasm, maturity, all of these things have to come across on the form, and you have to squeeze it in a way that is particular to you. What we find is that most forms could really be about anybody. You have to make it about you. So everything you say, you have to give an example or include an example of how it relates to you and your experience. You have to make it personal. It's very, very difficult to do, especially if you're still a student and you don't have much life experience. What we find is there are two types of people applying. There's those people who are at university who are absolute superstars, and we can see the potential in them already. You know, in London, in the commercial set, you'll have the people with the double firsts and the rack of A stars, that sort of stuff. And then you've got the people who can demonstrate not obvious potential, but have shown that they've been able to succeed in what they've done outside of academia, outside of the law even. And that's what you need to get across in your form. I could do a whole 2-hour talk on what to put in a form. That's my summary.
Thank you, Kane. And Ali, we lost you there for a minute. Do you want to come back on and...
Apologies for that. I've just switched over to my mobile hotspot. So thankfully it happened here and not at an actual hearing, although it did actually happen once at a hearing, unfortunately. I have to say, for context, because I'm a pupil, Kane and Jeanette are far more experienced. I think they're relatively close to the bar, 2007 and 2012, I think, from my Google search. So what you've heard from both is invaluable. In terms of the categories that Kane has touched on, I can't emphasize that enough. And it's pretty good to actually have some sort of checklist. And you can see these checklists on the websites of various chambers. Some chambers are more transparent than others. When I applied at St. Mary's, one thing that I did like was I had an indication of what I was getting into in terms of applying. And the feedback that was provided was incredibly helpful. Matrix Chambers, for example, provides a full breakdown of their selection criteria, as does many other chambers. So just look at that criteria. It will broadly be the same. You'll have academics, evidence of advocacy, evidence of experience relevant to the professional, interpersonal skills, particularly, for example, if you're trying to apply to a criminal set or a family set, you're going to be dealing with people going through what is probably the worst time in their lives, or has already gone through the worst part of their lives. There'll be various traumatic instances that you're going to have to deal with. So look for these checklists and just see broadly, and this is what I did, check the most recent tenants, perhaps within the last 5 years, and see, do I broadly fit within that? And the harsh reality is that when I was applying, I saw some chambers and I thought, there's no way. There's absolutely no way. I may as well conserve my energy and focus on applications where I think I might have a shot.
Thanks, Ali. So, Jeanette, I'm going to come over to you now, because you touched on earlier how you did your GCSEs, but you didn't do your A levels. So that was missing on your pupillage application. So what other things did you do to secure those marks, to secure pupillage? And how can students develop other skills to ensure that they have a good chance at securing pupillage if they don't actually have those A levels?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the form, the checklist is concerned that Kane talks about, it's a really good idea. I think he's just volunteered to do another session for you, Clara, on how to do a form. But I think that the way that I approached it, knowing that my form would be missing vital parts that are going to be part of the marking scheme of any chambers, I think the approach I made, I don't know whether it's the right approach or not, but I made sure I ticked all the other boxes. So public speaking, advocacy, you know, mooting, volunteering, mini pupillages, that sort of thing. But then I suppose my approach was, right, how do I stand out? And I remember my pupil master saying to me that at the end of the day, they can only interview a certain amount of people, like Kane just said, because hundreds and hundreds of people apply. And most barristers who are self-employed are giving up their weekends or their evenings, you know, juggling work and court and giving up their time free to interview people. And I remember my pupil supervisor saying, at the end of the day, we want to interview people and have people in front of us who we think are interesting people, that we want to have a conversation with them. So we read the form and they might have a really, really strange hobby or something like that. And that there was one, I can't remember what it was, but I don't know, somebody was, I don't know, in the part-time dressed up as a clown or did circus tricks or something like that, but it stood out. And my pupil supervisor would be, I really want to meet this person. I want to see what they look like. I want to see what they want to have to say. I want to hear about this hobby. So sometimes it can just be standing out from the crowd. And that's the approach I took. And I had a number of things that made me stand out. Not only the scholarship that I had from my local paper, which was, you know, something that doesn't really happen very often. When do you really hear of a newspaper paying for somebody's law degree? So that was quite interesting. But also when I got my scholarship for the bar course, I've got two small children at the time who were nursery age. Now, it was a ridiculous amount of money to put them through nursery, and there was at that time, there was no help for postgraduate fees and there was no help for nursery fees. When I was doing my undergraduate degree, because there was help with fees, I also had, I think, something like 85% of my nursery fees paid for. Come going to the bar, which was full-time, there was no help whatsoever. So I also had to get a part-time job behind a bar. So on a Thursday night, Friday night and Sunday lunchtime, on top of full-time bar course and two small children, I had to work 16 hours a week so I could get the tax credits and get the, I suppose, nursery childcare element of tax credits. So I'm not saying that that was what helped me, but I'm just explaining the position I was in. And it got to a point where I didn't have enough money to survive and enough money to pay my fees. And at one point, I was £4,000 short. And at that point, I was, where the hell am I going to get £4,000 from? And it was at the point where it was looking at I might have to give up because I was £4,000 short to pay my initial fees. So I decided to apply to go on a TV game show. Not really sure why I did that. I just remember knowing that I needed the money and literally sat there Googling how I could make money and somehow stumbled across be on a game show on the ITV website. And I saw a particular game show. It was called Minute to Win It on ITV. And you went on with 4 of your friends. And it was like these little games that you had to do in a minute to win the money. And you and your team were against another team. And whoever won at the end won the money. So I applied for that. So as you can imagine, that on my application form, quite a few chambers were quite interested to hear all about this game show that I went on. Karen Flack, who's sadly not with us anymore, was the captain on the other team, and Joe Swash was our team captain. And it was quite a story to tell. Not for the fact that when I applied, I hadn't told any of my 4 friends who I put on the form that I'd applied, and I suppose the researchers and company phoned them about it before I'd even had time to ask them if they wanted to go on a game show, which was quite funny. But I'm not saying that you have to apply to go on a game show, but sometimes, you know, you can have things in your life like unusual hobbies or unusual achievements, or you know, achievements like Mount Everest or whatever, that you might not think is relevant to your CV, but it's completely relevant because it says a lot about your personality. And at the end of the day, when you're applying for pupillage, members of chambers want to see in you somebody that they can sit in chambers with, that they can work with, that they can get along with, that share the same sort of personality, you know. So it's not all about academics and mooting, whereas that's always important. It's important that your personality shines through on your CV. And I think that's the approach I took. So I would encourage people to, you know, when they're building their CV and applying, really have a good think about anything that you have in your life that could maybe stand you out from the rest.
Thanks, Jeanette. I think I'm going to have to get my application into Gogglebox ASAP.
Oh yeah, yeah. Gogglebox. In fact, one of my friends is on Gogglebox. I sit on the board at the University of Derby with Bazit Siddiqui, who's from Derby.
Oh, cool.
So he's one of my good friends. Yeah.
The Siddiqui family, so, yeah. Oh, fantastic.
Not sure Gogglebox would have me, but
wow.
Yeah.
So when it comes to choosing a practice and applying to chambers for that particular practice, what advice could you give students who are adamant that they want to be a family law barrister, but they don't get the interview for that, they get the public law maybe, if they apply for that as well, if they're interested in both, they're more interested in the family set but end up going to public, is it worth their while getting into chambers, doing that pupillage to then specialise in something else, or should they just follow what they really want to do?
I could probably answer that one. The reality is, if you're applying for an area of law which is not for you, either you're not going to get the pupillage. It'll become painfully clear in the interview that this is not for you. So my advice would always be, I mean, it's difficult now during lockdowns, but get as much work experience as you can in barrister chambers, and that's hard to do now, I appreciate that. Spend as much time with barristers as you can. I used to be terrified of barristers, like massively intimidated. And it wasn't until I started having a mentor, spending time with people, you realize, oh, they're just normal people. They're very confident people, but normal people. And just get to know. I'm a personal injury lawyer. That is the least glamorous of all the areas of law, and I never once considered it. But when I did work experience in it, I thought, yes, this is for me. This is just right. And until you see it, you have no idea. But I wouldn't lie about what you want to do just to get a pupillage, because it's just not going to work.
There we go. Question answered.
From someone from the opposite end, as a more recent applicant, it could have just been coincidence, but I think it's very unlikely. When my applications were more refined, without even necessarily adding in more experience, but perhaps making it more obvious that I preferred a certain area of law, or that what I'd already done had related to a certain area of law, I got more first round interviews. And I noticed a spike in more first round interviews at family sets, when all I did under my qualifications, which normally people just put their university, their classification, unless you're still a student, then you put everything. I just added a single line that said optional module, family law. And I got way more first round interviews just because of that. And second round interviews in particular are quite intense, and they will grill you. And if you think you can just slide by and take a scattergun approach to your applications, it's going to come out. Now, I used to say at one point, you know what, if a shed offered me pupillage, I'd do it. I'd do it anywhere, fair enough. but you start to realize, you're going to have to tailor your applications and aim somewhere. There are mixed sets, and that's very true. And, particularly, for example, in an area of family law that ranges from public law dealing with local authorities to the other end of the spectrum, where you have ancillary relief, finance, and equity. And yes, new tenants are expected to do a bit of everything. You still have to somehow gear your application towards something. So I'll just say to anyone listening, it's just look at what you've already done and see, how can I make it a little bit obvious? I'm trying to make the point I'm applying to a family set or a crime set or whatever.
So yeah, when you finally get that call that you've got an interview, and then if you're lucky enough to get to the second interview, Kane, I'm going to come to you. How would you prepare for that? What advice would you give to students to prepare for that point?
But for a final round interview, you can't prepare because you don't know what's going to happen. Every chambers is different. They have a different approach. And I think realistically, the only way to prepare is to have a good night's sleep and then have about 8 coffees. And that seems to do the trick for me. Because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what you're going to be asked. And there's no other way to prepare. Of course, you need to know about your practice area because you're going to be asked questions about that. But you know that already because you've got to where you are because of it.
Thank you. And then when someone does secure that pupillage, what can you tell us about the work-life balance between being a barrister and then your own time and the self-employed element of it, or maybe the employed bar? Jeanette, sorry.
Sorry, just to unmute myself there. I have done both, so I'm lucky, I suppose, that I have been able to experience the self-employed bar and the employed bar. I did pupillage. After pupillage in London, I went back to the Midlands and I was practicing at Birmingham Chambers, and I think I've been there about 9 months or something like that, when unfortunately I had a very bad accident and I broke my ankle in 3 places and I could not walk for 6 months. And this was before the likes of CVP and video hearings. So my practice and my career came to an abrupt stop, basically. It was horrific. Obviously, the pain was horrific. At times, I felt really depressed because I thought, gosh, it's took me all this time and all this struggle to get here, and I'm never going to walk again, and all sorts. Within about 6 months, I did get a bit better to the point where I could walk. But basically, my consultant said to me I wouldn't be able to do all the running around that you do at the bar. I'm not sure what it's like for other practice areas, but certainly at the criminal bar, you can be at one court in the morning and another one in the afternoon. You're running on, on trains and off trains. You've got your robes in your hand, you've got your computer, you've got your books. It's quite physical. And I was told by my consultant there was just absolutely no way I would be able to do that. So at that point, I had to decide what to do. And I decided to apply for the Crown Prosecution Service because crime is the area that I work in, and I became a Crown Prosecutor. And I did that for about 9 months. Towards the end of, I think it was about 6 months, I went downhill again, even though I was working from home most of the time. My ankle got really bad. I got really bad arthritis in it. During lockdown, I had to go off sick, actually. But, being employed, because I was at the employed bar, I got sick pay. If I'd been at the self-employed bar, I wouldn't have had that support. And the CPS were really supportive of me. And I had to have time off. I was one of the first ones to have an urgent operation after the COVID, I think it was August last year. And that second operation was more of a success. So come September last year, when I felt a lot better and I could walk a lot better and I felt physically and mentally a bit better, I left the CPS and I went back to the independent bar. And I must say, I prefer being self-employed and I prefer the independent bar because I prefer to manage my own time. If I want to take time off, as long as I'm not committed on any particular cases or anything, I can take time off when I want to. if I'm not at court all day, say I have a hearing in the morning, I'm flexible to have the afternoon off if I want to, and then, you know, find time elsewhere to catch up on other work or other prep that I need to do, or, you know, unless I'm at court in person all day at the moment, a lot of mine hearings are online. I can take the kids to school, I can pick them up from school, you know, there's that flexibility. Whereas if I was working full time, I'd literally either be in the office 9 to 5 or literally chained to my computer 9 to 5. So there's benefits of both. You know, had I not been at the CPS at the time when I needed, I think I was off for about 2 months during my operation, I'd have been very in financial difficulty because I was self-employed. I wouldn't get any money. I think I don't think I was probably even entitled to statutory sick pay because I don't think I'd paid enough national insurance at that point. So, you know, perhaps, you know, if you do have a family and, you know, you do have the worry of finances and being able to, you know, afford things and things like that, or, you know, there are benefits of being employed, you know, holiday pay, sick pay, etc. But me personally prefer the independent bar because of just the flexibility, and there is a better work-life balance. Yes, there are going to be times when you've got a jury trial for 2 weeks and you're literally at court at 9 a.m. and you don't leave till 6 p.m. But there are other times where you do have that time to take off and be more flexible. So there's benefits of both. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Jeanette. And coming to you, Ali, what's it like being a pupil barrister, and, you know, the commitment to the bar and the effect maybe that it's had on your personal life and family life?
Well, obviously, you know, I still have 1 month left of pupillage, so you know, yes, keep that in mind. But but no, in all seriousness, one thing I will say is my pupillage was incredibly structured to a syllabus level, which was quite reassuring. I would know what areas I'd be dealing with, what my expectations are. You provided almost a constitution level document to that effect. But what I will say is, and I'm guilty of this as well, you try so hard to apply for pupillage, you don't actually think about what happens when you get it. You think about what happens when you finish pupillage, strangely, when you're attending, but you don't think about that period for pupillage. It is incredibly intense. And that, I think that's the nature of practice. As a pupil, you'll naturally be on your supervisor's cases initially, and these will be individuals with decades of experience. Those aren't the cases you're going to be dealing with yourself. But I genuinely feel I am far more capable of dealing with my own cases because I saw the far more difficult cases. So, for example, something I often say is, on my first day, the bundle I was required to read for a case was over 1,000 pages. The bundles you have on the bar course to prepare for certain things are what, 12 pages, 30 pages between there? I remember speaking to one of the previous pupils, and before I could even utter the words, wow, over 1,000 pages, they said, yeah, you know, my first bundle was 3,000 pages. Oh, yeah. Yeah, me too. Yeah, just as hard. It is incredibly intense, but you learn and you're given consistent feedback and guidance. This is how I do things. This is how you should do things, and so on and so forth. But in terms of work-life balance, and the point I was saying to Clara and everyone else before this was there was this huge discussion on Twitter about the work-life balance at the bar, and has already been alluded to, the benefit of being self-employed is you have control, at least in theory, but you sacrifice a degree of security for that. When you're a pupil, if you're dealing with these massive cases without necessarily the experience, because you're still learning, what will take someone who knows those areas 2 hours to deal with something might take you 10. I had instances of, as all pupils do, as all tenants do, of just pretty much just working non-stop, and it can be exhausting. But thankfully, I have supervisors who check in, and well-being now is being pushed more. I don't know whether Kane and Jeanette can perhaps touch on this. My impression is that well-being on the bar was perhaps nowhere near as touched on in previously, or at least in other professions. very strangely, I actually have far more of a better work-life balance dealing with my own cases, because I remember dealing with my first case, and I never would have said this before pupillage, where I said, oh, it's only 100 pages. Wow, it's only 100 pages. That's wonderful. So there's a long way to go in terms of well-being at the bar. You will be working weekends. That's if you have a Monday hearing and you get papers on the Friday, it's out of your control. You're going to be working on the weekend. There's the Sunday night club you might have seen on Twitter and social media. Unfortunately, that's a little bit of the norm, but you need to establish your own boundaries and ensure that you balance out what you have to do and what you can do. They're not necessarily the same things. But again, as a pupil, it is quite refreshing to see that aspect of it, but I don't think people are prepared. They might be under the impression that once you do pupillage, oh, you're working, 9 to 5 in theory. No, you are, if you have a skeleton argument to prep at the last minute for whatever reason, you might be working into the early hours of the morning. That's the reality of it. But yeah.
And Kane, I'm going to come across to you on this one as well about the work-life balance, because obviously it affects everyone in many different ways. So what's your experience been like?
Because you have control and because you're self-employed, it's very difficult to say no. That's the first problem. Oh, we can give more work to you. It pays £300. Do you want to do it? Yes, of course. And before you know it, you've just got a big pile of work. The other issue is work is a bottomless pit. We're not paid necessarily by the hour. So if you've got a piece of work, you could spend half an hour on it, or you could spend 3 days on it. And you need to learn where to draw the line. It's very difficult because your own well-being is within your own control. And too many of my colleagues have burned out. It's just knowing when to stop and knowing when to give up would be my advice.
Thank you. So I'm going to move over to the questions that have come in this evening from our attendees. We've got a question here. I know of people who have had lower than a 2-2 in their degree, and it's never been accepted for pupillage. And is this still the case? Okay.
Well, the reality is that nearly everybody in my chambers who's got a pupillage in the last 10 years either has a first or a 2-1. We did take on a pupil with a 2-2. It is insane rarity, but this person with the 2-2 had 10 years of experience after getting the 2-2, which more than showed that she had the academic ability to do the job. And the reality is that people who get 2-2 don't get it because they're thick. They do it because they don't apply themselves. So if you can demonstrate later on that you apply yourself and you do have the ability, it doesn't really matter. It just makes it a lot harder.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got to think about it. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be applying for, well, doing the BTC or applying for pupillage straight after getting a 2-2, because you'll be at an enormous disadvantage. You'll be right at the bottom of the pile.
So what advice could you give to students who do perhaps get that 2-2? Because even on LinkedIn and Facebook now, I'm seeing quite a lot of students graduating and it is 2-2, unfortunately, and that is due to the pandemic. Will there be any allowances for students who can mitigate that, I suppose, going forward? Yeah. And how can they help themselves?
Well, what you're demonstrating by having a good grade is that you have the ability to apply yourself and that you have brains. That's what the degree classification is for. So you have to find other ways of doing that. One way is to do a master's and try and get a distinction in a master's, something like that, just to show, okay, I messed that up, but now look what I can do. Or to show that competence in other ways by doing something completely different and succeeding in that way. Those are the two paths you can take. If you think about it, you need to prove that you're clever and you need to prove that you're diligent, and you just need to find ways of doing that.
Could I just add to that as well that, I mean, the reason why a lot of chambers want to see a 2-1 is, like Kane said, a lot of students do tend to go A-levels, university, pupillage. So of course the 2-1 is the demonstration that you do have the intellectual ability and everything, because at that point there's little else to evidence that. What I would say is, it's a marathon, not a sprint. You don't have to go straight from university to the bar course to pupillage, and in fact not everybody does that. I didn't go for my pupillage until the 5th year, because between being called to the bar and applying for pupillage, I wasn't in the position to be able to go and do a pupillage. You know, like I said earlier on, I'd split up with my husband. I was now a single mother. My children, I think, were only 2 and 3 at the time. You know, I couldn't have really done a pupillage at that point. So I went away and I got a full-time job, but a job that was relevant to the work I wanted to do. I wanted to do crime. I became a criminal investigator for the Home Office. So I investigated immigration crime, but it was relevant. And the skills that I learned in that job, I was able to apply to my applications 4 years later. And I think that really helped. I think if I'd applied straight from university or straight from the bar course, I probably wouldn't have got any interviews. You know, you don't have to rush it, especially if you've gone to university straight from your A-level, so you're in your early 20s. There's absolutely no rush. And in fact, you know, the kind of work that we do, especially in crime, like Ali said, you know, family in crime, you know, sometimes you're dealing with people that are you know, the point in their life where, you know, they're dealing with, you know, whatever they are, tragedy, or, you know, probably the worst point that they'll ever be in their life. You know, it's very important in those roles to have people skills, to have maturity, to have some life experience, because, you know, somebody's going to turn around to you as your barrister and they want to see those skills in you and know that when they tell you about their situation, that you have skills like empathy and you can understand. You know, if you're somebody fresh out of university and you haven't got a clue and you've led quite a sheltered life, you're not going to get that sort of you know, do you know what I mean? It's hard to explain. So don't think that you have to rush. Bear in mind as well, once you're called to the bar and you get pupillage, and hopefully pupillage goes well and you start your life as a practicing barrister, you're going to have 30, 40, 50 years of your career, you know, and it is a hard job. It's a rewarding job, but go and do something else, you know, for 3 or 4 years, 2 years, you know, go and do something else. Go and do a job that's not quite so intense. Still got to be related in some way. Go and see the world or whatever. There's absolutely no rush. And in my view, applying a bit later with a bit more life experience, with a bit more maturity and more skills, you've got more chance of getting interviews.
I think Jeanette's absolutely right. Just to say, the average age of a pupil in my chambers over the last few years has been about 28 or 29.
Okay, so what would you say to older students like myself? I'm mature student, mid-30s. What would you say to them that, you know, I used to be a hairdresser, so let's use me for an example. And I have 4 children, so gaining outside experience hasn't, you know, been right there for me. I can't drop everything and travel to do a mini pupillage. I can't drop everything and go to a meeting or advocacy competition. What other things could a mature student do?
Well, the obvious one is what you're doing right now.
Apart from this.
It's very difficult. I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. But I think what you have to do, if you are an older candidate, someone who's done other things, had a family first, you need to set that out in your application. Make it about you. Show your pathway. Show the decisions you made and what you've learned in your time being a parent, doing whatever you were doing in your field. It's just tricky. How to get the experience, I don't know. See if there's chambers that are willing to let you, for example, sit in on a remote hearing. Might be quite tricky. It might be, I think a lot of chambers are doing remote mini pupillages now, which is easier to do because you can sit there at home, almost like having the telly on in the background and watch something.
Yeah, they have been interesting.
It's very, very difficult. You might find chambers that are willing to let you come in just for one day or half a day. Other than that, I don't really have an answer to that. It's hard.
Do you think, this is to everyone, do you think it's worthwhile finding a mentor, building a LinkedIn profile and really reaching out to people, because a lot of barristers do want to help. I have a few mentors. Do you think it's worthwhile for someone to do that, especially say if they're in their final year of their law degree, they're stuck, they don't quite know what path they want to take, they don't know what they want to practice in? Ali?
What my mentor was allocated to me from Lincoln's Inn, Nicholas Clark, who was invaluable, always willing to speak to me whenever I came to London, provide advice on really the application process. So the thing I'll say to students is the inns generally will allocate you a mentor in general, that this is someone who to some extent will be your main port of call. But as you've alluded to, Clara, things have changed a little bit now, particularly with LinkedIn and stuff, and people have mentees all over the place. So I definitely think it's worthwhile, particularly for the points I've mentioned earlier, you know, getting people to look at your CVs, getting people to look to give you advice. Yes, there is a formal application process for mini pupilages. It's obviously not formalized and regulated like pupillage for good reason. It's work experience. But for all the problems that unfortunately the recent pandemic has brought in terms of people's ability to access, for example, different parts of their university, what it has brought is, for example, virtual minis. And suddenly, wait a minute, things became far more accessible, because part of the issue with mini pupilages being inaccessible was A, the cost, and B, you know, being able to take that time out. Who you know, it's quite a privileged position to be able to take a day off work for the purposes of a mini pupillage. But when I was able to secure minis through people I'd met in conferences by volunteering, I always found they were far more amenable to be flexible. Oh, I could just do a day, or I could just attend a certain hearing. So that's just generally my advice. In terms of the topic you touched on earlier about mature students and what they can do, I know I appreciate your response to Kane, but I agree with Kane. Pretty much what you're doing is a very good example of how you can set yourself aside. Jump on anything that's virtual. Essay competitions, incredibly underrated. The law reform essay competition, this is you demonstrating your view and your ability to provide a document as to a change in an area of law. That should be brilliant on an application, and a lot of people don't apply for that. So obviously, if you're a parent or a mature student or both, you may not be able to travel as often. That's very true. But if you perhaps knew that there was a deadline in 3 months, enter essay competitions. Mooting competitions have to an extent moved to a more virtual platform as well. So hopefully that we do return to some degree of normality, with the best aspects of remote working hopefully staying. Or will say to mature students is, now it appears we're more virtual than ever, and this is really your time to get that experience.
Thanks, Ali. I'm going to go to a couple more questions before we end the evening. So we've got a question come in. Do you have any top tips on securing pupillage? Kane.
Get a first, get a distinction in a master's, have about 5 A stars at A level, be world mooting champion. You know, those are the only ways you can really walk in. You know, be super impressive. Nobel Prize. There's no way of there's no easy way of doing it. You just have to be a well-rounded person who can demonstrate all the different competencies.
Lovely, thank you. We've got another one here. What are the requirements for scholarships? Do you have to have a 2-1 or a 2-2 and above? Does anyone want to jump in on that one?
I'm not sure about that. I know obviously to apply for a scholarship you have to be doing the BVC, I think they've called it again. I think it was the BVC, then the BPTC. Now I think it's the BVC again. They keep changing their mind. So I think you have to, you know, get a place on that. And of course, like Kane was saying earlier, I think a lot of the requirements of getting a place on that is the 2-1. So I'm not really sure about that. Perhaps you can apply for scholarship if you've got a 2-2. I'm not sure. But as far as scholarships from the inns are concerned, as well, I saw a few other questions about scholarships. You know, how do you decide, you know, where to apply and everything, and what are the criteria? Each inn has different criteria for scholarships. Some of them, for instance, are means tested. So unless you can show that you really do need the money and the assistance, then you might get a scholarship so that you can put it on your CV, but it might not be much money, for instance, because they've looked at your parents' income and things like that, and you don't actually need the money. So some are means tested. I think Middle Temple I applied to wasn't means tested, but also Middle Temple, for instance, they interview everybody that applies for scholarship, whereas I know other inns, there's an application. I mean, there was an application for Middle Temple, but there's an application selection criteria. Not everybody gets an interview, whereas Middle Temple interview everybody. And I won't lie, that's why I applied for Middle Temple, because I knew that I would at least have the opportunity to sit in front of somebody, because of course I'd got this big hookup on my A levels and things like that and wasn't sure, and so I applied. So have a look at each inn's criteria because they are all different.
Thanks, Jeanette. We have a question for Ali. Your call to the bar was 2015, and in the interim, you were a lecturer. The question is, have you been applying for pupillage since your call and only recently secured one, or did you only apply recently?
It's sort of a bit of both. So once I finished my undergrad and finished the bar course, there was a question of, well, what do I do now? I always saw myself as sort of the bridesmaid of applicants. I actually didn't seem to have much of an issue getting to second round interviews. I was quite fortunate about that. And I probably secured more second rounds than most people I know. I just couldn't seem to get the pupillage. So that kept me going. So I applied in the sort of very shortly after I completed the BPTC. I keep changing the letters myself. The bar, I'll just talk the bar course. There was a little bit of a gap, and then I applied closer to actually securing pupillage. So there was some extent of a gap. But what I will say about that is, once you need to be very careful about losing momentum. It's very stressful, and if you stop entirely, it is very hard to really get back on the horse, because you'll realize, wait a minute, I'm a lot less stressed. Why am I less stressed? It's because you're not applying. But as Kane said, I think the stats actually indicate the average candidate is between the ages of 25 to 35 or 34, something like that. So it's not quite unusual now to have more and more applicants getting pupillage a few years afterwards. I would just generally say is analyze your applications. I have a myriad of files I now will no longer use. And this touches on the point you asked about the top tips. I always had a notebook, and at the end of every interview wrote down what I was asked and what I did poorly. And you'd be surprised how often the same thing actually comes up again. And so there's some degree of trial and error. But yeah, so I pretty much applied straight after the bar course and pretty much just before getting the pupillage.
Thanks, Ali. And unfortunately, that's all we've got time for this evening. So I'd just like to thank you all, Kane, Ali, and Jeanette, for coming along this evening and answering the questions from all of our guests. And I'd like to say to all the attendees, keep an eye out for another upcoming event, Parenting at the Bar, where I shall be talking openly with a number of barristers, QCs and clerks about their experiences of being a parent in the legal profession and what can be expected from the profession when expecting. Thank you again to all the panellists this evening. Don't forget to follow Aspiring Barristers on all platforms, and of course, do connect with us on LinkedIn. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you for having us.
Good evening.
Good night. Good luck, everybody.
Best of luck.